Adrian Welly, and for the Senate District 9, Al Doty and Paul Gazelka. Thank you all for being here tonight. We will start with Mark Anderson for his opening statement.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Anderson again. I am 54 years old. I grew up in Wadena. I currently have a fiance. We are planning on getting married this next month. And I did mention to her that our wedding date is not conditional on the outcome of this election. Just wanted to let you know that. If this is being recorded, perfect. She understands.
It is.
I've got a daughter who's 18 years old. She's in her first year in college. The reason I'm running, I am from this area. I love this area. I've been in this area most of my life. I am a businessman. I'm also a professional pilot. I do both of those as a self-employed individual. So I understand what a business finance is, and I also understand what leadership is, because that's how I run my cockpit. And I think I can do that very well at the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Niles.
Good evening, I'm Don Niles. Good evening. Much better. I'm Don Niles. I'm running for House Representatives District 9A. I'm running for three primary reasons. One, to make sure we have adequate funding for public education. Two, to rebalance taxes as between property tax, sales tax, and income tax. Property taxes have gotten way out of kilter relative to the other two. And most of all, to make sure that we have legislators who are actually willing to work with each other and to make sure that we get things done in St. Paul. As a Minnesotan, I was terribly embarrassed that our state set the record for the longest state government shutdown in the history of the United States. I'm married to my wonderful wife, Lonnie, who's in the second row here. She's a media specialist, librarian in the Wadena Deer Creek school system. I'm finishing up a 4-year term on the Wadena City Council, where I was chair of the Wadena 2.0 committee. I also serve as vice chair of the Kitchigami Regional Library Board. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Creashan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. What a nice night to be here for a forum. I came to the area as an educator in technology and curriculum and actually worked with the Long Prairie School District and helped wire the hands of old courthouse. So I'm very familiar with many of the buildings in your area. I left teaching to start a company, Atomic Learning, which did online education. And from there, I left there 5 years ago after growing that to an international business. Yes, you can build an international business in central Minnesota. And I started a rural economic development company. All of that has taught me that it's hardworking men and women that make the difference, not government. I'm married 19 years with 5 beautiful children, and I'm hoping to pass the values on to them that I learned from my grandfather about how hard work can get you through life. I'll make this really simple. I'm not going to bring St. Paul to this area. I'm going to take this area down to St. Paul. I don't believe that government is a religion. My Catholic faith is my religion, and that's who I am. And if you're not for a lot of government, then I'm the wrong guy.
Thank you. Mr. Welly.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Adrian Welly. I'm a lifelong resident of this district. I grew up on a family farm out near Lastrip. I am in the 4th year of my first term on the Pierce City Council, where I currently live. I was the intern administrator for the city of Little Falls. I currently serve now as the clerk treasurer in the city of Upsala. Some of you recognize me and always say, how do I know you? Well, I used to manage Perkins in Little Falls. And if you ever want to know how people feel about government, go manage a restaurant for a while. Have over coffee, they'll tell you anything. I have a bachelor's degree from St. Paul State University in Public Administration. And the reason I'm running is I think it's time for us to have a strong voice for rural Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Doty.
Thanks to everyone who's putting this on and everyone who's showing up. I've lived over 40 years in this district. My great-grandparents came here after they finished fighting the Civil War and settled in Birchdale Township. So we've been around a long time here. My wife, who's sitting in the back, her family has farmed in this district for 3 generations. So we understand the district very well. I grew up on a farm in western Minnesota. I went to the University University of Minnesota at Morris, graduated from there with a degree in political science. I taught and coached wrestling for a long time at Pierce, including against some good wrestling teams over here in this part of the county. I was hired as senior advocate by Horizon Health at Pierce to deal with the problems of aging. And my job description was simple. Whatever the senior citizens needed help with, give them that help. I spent a lot of time talking about Part D and all those difficult things and helping people with individual problems in Morrison, Crow Wing, and Todd County. Currently, I'm on the City Council in Royalton. I'm on the Board of Directors of Pine Grove Zoo in Little Falls, and I'm on the Camp River Citizens Advisory Council.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gazelka.
Well, good evening. I'm Paul Gazelka. I presently am the state senator in Morrison County. I hope to serve for this region as well. I guess the end we'll know November 6th. But I'm the State Farm Insurance Agent on 371 in Baxter. I've done that my whole life, having 3 to 7 employees. I know what it takes to create a job. It's not the government. We need to unleash the private sector. My wife is here, Mary Lee. We've been married 30 years. We have 5 kids, age 26 all the way down to 11. The 11-year-old came a little later, and like my dad said, with 10 kids, he didn't have time for midlife crisis in his life. So, but it's an honor to serve down there, and we have serious problems. But we can find solutions, and we find those solutions together. I'm a listener. I listen to what the rural concerns are. We do a lot of good legislation that impact rural Minnesota. My hope is that we can talk about it here. Finally, I'll say I'm endorsed by MCCL, the NRA, Minnesota Farm Bureau, NFIB, and the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, among many.
Thank you. We will start with our first prepared question. The candidates will have 2 minutes to respond to these first 2 questions. The first one, similar to the commissioners, what are your top 3 budget priorities in relation to a balanced state budget? And for this, we will start with Mr. Creeshan.
Okay. When I look at the budget, as a former CFO, one of the first things that you look for is how you can control costs. And I understand the pressures that are put upon us here in rural Minnesota. But we have to go down to St. Paul, and we have to fight for the fact that we have to continue to keep that expense line down. We have to hold those. We can't let those costs get overrun, because every cost that's overrun, there's only 3 areas of income, or there's only 3 areas of taxes. There's income tax, sales tax, and property tax. So if it's coming out of one area, it's going to end up in the other one. So it's very important that we go down there and we continue to maintain what we've done in rural America and not let the metro area continue to run our budget. So that's the first area. I would hold those expenses down. I'd look for departments that we can eliminate through retirement attrition. There are areas that we can consolidate, and we have a tough economy right now. We have to realize that fact. We can't go down there with fairy dust and hope it's going to get better. We've got to make some tough decisions, and that's part of who I am. The second thing, and the commissioners touched upon it, we've got to grow the areas. We've got to continue to attract people to the rural areas of Minnesota, specifically Todd and Morrison County, and we've got to let them know. I've done it. I've built a business here. It's a great labor force. You get unbelievable loyalty. You need to let everyone know that we can grow from the inside out here. We're probably not going to find a manufacturing company. We're not going to be chasing smokestacks, but there are entrepreneurs out there. There's people in their garages today that are making businesses. How do we get the mandates away from them so they can grow? Let's get the sewer mandates out so they can put a little shop up in their backyard. And the third thing is, we're going to have to consider some revenue options, and one of which is through loopholes and deductions. A good example is right now we give an income tax credit to a company that invests overseas. Why don't we shift that income tax to somebody that invests in rural America? Someone that invests in Todd County, Morrison County, and shift those dollars here. The labor force is just as good here. So why are we going across the pond when I know we can do it right here? So those are the areas that I would look at.
Thank you. Mr. Welly.
Well, first I'm going to say that I think that borrowing $2.4 billion from our schools was a bad priority. Going into the 3 things that we need to cut wasteful spending, and we need to audit government programs to get rid of those that aren't working, to help government to run more efficiently. Second thing is we need to close corporate loopholes. And the third thing for me is I want to know why I, in the middle class, pay a higher tax rate than those making over $250,000 a year. I think that we should have uniform tax where we all pay the same percent. That will be one way to do this. That will help us get some funding back on track to take the burden off rural Minnesota and our property tax system, which continually seems to be getting hit.
Thank you. Mr. Doty?
Well, I think we definitely need to move towards helping the middle class. We went the wrong direction these last 2 years. There are three things that I voted for over and over again when I was in the House of Representatives. I served 2 terms and then got beat last time, as most of you know. You get beat when you stick up for small towns and small business. You don't get beat by small town money, you get beat by the big money. And when you see what I'm proposing here, you'll see why they were pretty interested in doing that. I voted several times for income tax increases on those making over $250,000. Right now they pay 8 point something, we pay 12 point something. I don't think that's fair. I would even that out. I voted several times to close foreign operating corporation loopholes. I don't think sending our jobs and sending our profits overseas is the right message to send. We should reward that. We should be collecting from that. And the third thing I think we need to do is something else I voted for. We need to figure inflation for expenses, not just income, when we're doing our budget projections for the state. I don't know how many of you know that this happens, but when they're figuring out the budget for the next year, they figure inflation for income, and they build that in. But they don't figure inflation for expenses. You would never do that. Well, if you did, you wouldn't be doing it wrong because you'd be out of business. All three of those things are things that I voted for. And all three of those things were things that were vetoed by then Governor Valenti. Send me back, I'll vote for those again.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka?
When I look at budget priorities, there's the first 2 major pillars that I look at. One is zero-based budgeting or something like that, where you're not going to spend more than you have. So you prioritize all the way down to you run out of money, the things that are low priority you don't pay. And secondly, because I'm out of state, I want to have a rural focus. And so if you look at some of the things we did last year, we almost doubled the regional parks and trails money. We increased deep rural nursing homes. We gave a literacy bonus, which benefited rural schools more than metro. We got more to roads and bridges and away from transit in the city. So when we talk about how do we focus, you want to focus on rural. Some of the major areas, we want to pay back the school shift. In 2010, prior to the time I got there, when it was DFL control, there was a $2 billion education shift, which is a delay of payments. And then there was another $700 million this time around. We paid back about half of that $700 million. We passed legislation to pay back the other half of that $700 million, but that was vetoed. But it still should be our goal to pay that back. It's a delay of payment. It'll help our schools. Secondly, we want to look at roads and bridges. I mentioned that, but that is where we benefit. If we're going to put money in transportation, it should be roads and bridges. Thirdly, the most vulnerable, and I mean the most vulnerable. I don't mean people that shouldn't be on welfare, but those that are seniors that need help, disabled, vulnerable children. But finally, I added more than 3 because there's so many more things you have to work on. I mean, we have a $6 billion budget shortfall. We have $2 billion of school shift. We have no money in our budget reserve account, which should be $1 billion. We add those up, it's about $9 billion. But at the end of the day, we ended up having a surplus. We have a $1.2 billion surplus right now. We have $1 billion in the cash reserves, and we paid back part of the school shift. But finally, I'd say we ought to focus on how do we help the private sector grow jobs. And 2 major things that we can do, we can repeal the state surcharge on business property taxes for small business owners. It's a 30% amount that goes directly into the state coffers, and we can stop that without hurting local property taxes.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson?
When I look at the 3 top priorities in my view, I have to start with just the one as a summary. It's called tax and spend. This is what we do. Well, that's what the government does. They tax and spend. That's been a buzzword for years. But unfortunately, about 30, 40 years ago, they lost track of that. It's called spend and then tax. And that's where they came up with this definition of this word deficit. We spent too much, you need to pay more. There's a figure that I found last night. It's a figure that I've tried to find for years, and all I did last night was just go onto the Office of State Management and Budget in Minnesota here. This figure is $62 million. That's how much money the state will spend between now and the end of 2013. Nobody likes to talk about that figure. That is the biggest figure I've ever heard. Everybody likes to talk about general fund, but we're gonna take in $62 billion next year. We're also going to spend $62 billion next year. Now, where is all that money going? Well, according to what I've even read off of the same website, 15 billion of that is going to go to our schools. That's a good thing. And that's a good chunk, but that's not the biggest chunk of the budget. 41% of that goes to health and human services. There's a lot of waste there. I'm not talking about taking money away from elders or anybody that really, really needs the care. But that equates to $26 billion. That supersedes school spending. And if you want to talk about the shift, if we've got $15 billion in school spending, why do we even have a shift in the first place?
Thank you. Mr. Niles.
Thank you. I'd look at every dollar spent by government on a return on investment basis. There are always competing priorities as to how the dollars will be spent. And what we need to do as legislators is to look at all of the state governmental departments and say, are we getting the biggest bang for our dollar? Similar to what your commissioners were saying here tonight, spending wisely is the top priority. The second priority for a balanced budget in the next session, as I mentioned in my opening, is to rebalance the three-legged stool so that the income, property, and sales taxes resume the shock absorber effect that they had 10 years ago, where if the economy falters in one area, there's somewhat of a shock absorber effect so that you don't feel the big hit, especially in rural Minnesota, where we felt the big hit after the legislature raised taxes last session. Thirdly, I would like to make sure that we reduce and eventually eliminate borrowing from schools as a manner of funding our government. It just seems like we should not be using our children's future as a way to make ends meet, and we cannot do that in one budget session, but ultimately I'd like to see that happen. And in order to have that happen, you're going to have legislators who are there and willing to work with people and willing to say, gee, I don't have all the answers, it's not my way or the highway, and so I'll be someone who makes sure we get a budget and get a budget without a government shutdown.
Thank you. We are going to stay on money issues with our second question. Rural Minnesota has shouldered the burden of most of the state's changes to the property tax system. Can you assess what changes can be made to more effectively relieve the burden on rural taxpayers? And at this point, I'd like to also remind audience members, if you have questions, just hold your hand up and our ladies will come and collect them. And for this question, we will start with Mr. Dobie.
64% of the property tax increase, which came from removing the homestead credit this last legislative session, 64% of that increase falls on rural Minnesota. Rural Minnesota does not have 64% of the money or 64% of the people in the state. But we got 64% of that increase. Removing the homestead credit was done for reasons which people claim that the payments weren't being made. Well, in some cases they weren't being made. That's the problem. The problem wasn't the homestead credit. It was a system that would work just fine if we hadn't raided the cookie jars. And so the state needs to be responsible. The state needs to quit pretending that school funding and other things are fair game for the general fund. We need to get back to it, as others have mentioned, the three-legged stool. we don't have a cushion when we rely too heavily on property taxes. And the worst part of property taxes is, as you all know who live here, they fall on the elderly, they fall on the young families, they fall on our farms. We talk about jobs, we talk about jobs, we talk about jobs. The biggest business in our area, the most jobs in our area are farms. And our farmers got hurt badly by those property tax increases. And the Department of Revenue is very plain in saying that those came from removing the homestead credit. So we need to work towards restoring the fairness that we have with homestead credit.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka.
Can I have 5 minutes?
Sorry.
First of all, the homestead market value credit changing to the market value exclusion. I can tell you that in 2007, my opponent in the DFL passed that. It was vetoed by Governor Maloney because it also had an income tax increase. It came back to us again this year. It was sponsored by or promoted by the Greater Minnesota Cities, League of Counties, League of Cities. There was nobody saying we shouldn't do it, just like there wasn't in 2007, because it brought transparency. But in effect, people's property taxes did go up. They went up 4% rural. They went up about a little less than 1% metro. But a big part of that has to do with ag values. Ag values have been going up and up and up. And residential and business property tax values have been going down. So when ag has a bigger piece of the pie, they're going to pay more. If you look back in 2010, ag taxes went up 15%. Ag taxes this year went up 10%. Both of them are too high. So what do we do about it? Because we've got to find solutions. That's what we're all here for. I'll tell you one that I'm exploring for seniors is freezing senior property values, their values, unless they go down. Because they're the ones that have limited income. So how do we work with that? I want to work for ag land reform. We have talked about a production capacity rather than just giving them an ag value based on the sale of land around them. I want to continue targeted property tax credits. We increased targeted property tax credits this year that go directly to the homeowner, not to your local government. But basically, if your taxes went up $100 and 12% was 12% and $100 or more, you were going to get a credit. So there were a variety of things that we worked on. We will keep the ag credits. Whoever asked that, we did keep that. That was something that we had to debate and fought for. But we need to work with the lobbyists that support you, that are promoting these kind of things. And we need to work with the local governments and then find a solution together, because that's how we're going to solve this. If you got the feds that are $1 trillion short every year and they stop spending money and they pass it down to us, it just means we're all going to have to work together.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
During this campaign, I've had the opportunity to come in contact with a lot of people in the farming community. But one of the things that they brought up to me is the same thing about the rural taxes. And what I did is I contacted a friend who's a corporate tax attorney, and he also does a lot of the work in the rural areas. And he said basically the same thing as Senator Gazelka said, is that the property values for farms are going up. If the values go up, it fits right in the formula. Unfortunately, the formula is not really fair to the farming community right now. Is there something that can be done about that? Yes. I can go back to this, and you'll probably hear me say this a few times tonight. It's this term, it's called, or this figure, it's called $62 billion that is coming in revenue. What are we doing with that money? Do we really need to be raising people's property taxes? Because every cent that we take in, we spend. So if we're taking in 62, we're going to spend 62. Now, my view in regard to this homestead credit, we've all got it. But isn't that really kind of a shell game by the politicians? You pay your taxes. Oh, and we're going to give you a little bit of incentive to make you feel good. We'll give you a credit back. Why don't you just give me a fair rate in the first place and save the time?
Thank you. Mr. Niles.
The tax increase for Minnesota property taxes as a result of the Republican 2011 Special Session Act, as reported by the League of Rural Voters, was $370 million statewide. That's how much statewide taxes were. And as former Representative Doty mentioned, 64% of that was rural. So for that tax increase, the average was 5.3% statewide, and the statistics by the League of Rural Voters says that that was 8.6 higher in District 9. For ag land, that increase was 10.9% in District 9 as compared to 6.4% in statewide. And again, that statewide overall increase was 5.3%. For Long Prairie, it was 14% overall. For Staples, it was 12.9% overall. And for Wadena, my hometown, it was 9.3% overall. What we need to do, as I mentioned, is to rebalance the three legs of the stool to provide a shock disorder effect, especially in rural Minnesota, where property taxes hit us harder than elsewhere, with a lower income base here in Todd County, Wadena County, and most of Cass County, which is the new District 9A. Putting it all on the backs of property taxes is going to have a very detrimental effect. I'm in favor of restoring the homestead credit. As a member of the Wadena City Council, we lowered our levy, but at the time of board assessment, we had our citizens in there telling the city council or asking the city council why we raised their taxes, and we had to explain to them, we lowered our levy, but your taxes went up. Lastly, I would say as part of balancing the budget, we need to restore local government aid. That's a system that was designed to make sure rural cities in particular have the resources to deliver fire, police, and safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Krishan.
Folks, we don't have the money. If you think back to the earlier legislative session, we were staring down, by many accounts, $5 to $6 billion in debt. Okay, so I can sit up here and I can tell you, yeah, let's go down and restore the property tax, but I'm not about more government programs. If we were to put a $300 million program back in the coffer, where does it come from? Do we borrow more from tobacco funds? We already cut $1.8 billion. Do we make that 2.1? Do we take more from the schools? Because that's not a good idea. We're all up here for education. The fact of the matter is we don't have the money. Right now it's a horrible economy and this hurts. I paid my property tax a couple weeks ago. I'm sure as many of you did, it hurts. I know that. The reason I want this job is because I want to go down there with a voice for rural Minnesota and say, we're sick and tired of being treated differently just because we're outside the 496, 694 corridor. And in order to do that, we're going to have to fight for those dollars. There's a St. Paul Saints stadium that was built. Probably going to be a beautiful stadium. Not going to do a damn thing for us up here in Minnesota, rural Minnesota. And that's what we need to go down there and fight for. The other thing that I haven't heard here is there's a huge tug of war right now between economic development growth and businesses. Businesses, as a business owner, we're taxed 30% more or 1.5 times more plus 30% on top of that. If you want people to bring in more companies, bring in more jobs, we've got to help them out as well. Because when there's a shift in property taxes, for as much as it hurts on us on the real estate side for our residential, it hurts businesses and farmers more. And I heard it time and time again here. I hear it in Morrison County. We need to bring employers in. We need to bring jobs in. We need to make incentives so those people will be attracted here, not pushed away. We have one of the most complicated tax systems in the country. I travel the country for an economic development company that I started. And everybody says, oh my gosh, taxes in Minnesota are such a headache. It's because we add these programs, we add these layers, and it's very complicated.
Thank you. Mr. Whaley.
Well, property taxes reached their highest level in the 154-year history of the state. 8 times higher in rural Minnesota for homeowners, 3 times higher for rural businesses. I think it's time we stick up for rural Minnesota and tell the legislature to quit sticking it to us and restore this credit. Working in local government, we've seen local government aid held or not increased and cut. That went back in a property tax increase. Working on 2 budgets every year in the city of Piers and in the city of Upsala, we've not raised the levy in 6 years. How much longer are we going to continue to cut before this is going to affect us and we're going to have to raise the levy? And guess what? That's coming back to you, the property tax owners. The school shift, we're passing referendums, another property tax increase. Enough is enough. Let's stop with this. restore the credit, and find a fairer way throughout the state.
Thank you. We're now going to move into the section where the candidates will have 1 minute to respond to these questions. And we're going to switch gears a bit, related, but on the other side of the budget question is, can you give us 1 or 2 concrete ideas of how you can make sure rural Minnesota has livable wage jobs? What can you do to improve economic development, bring businesses into our area? And for this, we're going to start with Mr. Niles.
In my law practice, I deal with people throughout the world and throughout the United States, and I'm able to do that because I have a good broadband connection and a very good telephone connection. So when I do court filings in the federal courts throughout the United States, I do that over the internet from my office in Wadena, where I pay property taxes at a commercial rate because Mayor Walden made me get a conditional use permit in order to work out of a house. So I pay some pretty high taxes as a business owner for that property tax. But I think having the infrastructure that is needed, I was one of the charter members of the Minnesota State Bar Association Communications Law Section. My friend, Senator Amy Klobuchar, was the first chair of that, and I also was a professor at William Mitchell College of Law, where I taught regulation of telecommunications. Broadband infrastructure is very important in getting that deployed, and getting that out here will help us get the jobs. So that's one of my main priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Prisha.
Don't start the clock yet. Economic development is a balancing act, but the first thing we have to do out here is we have to believe in ourselves. As I said, there's folks in garages right now and basements. I was one of them. I've been one of them. They're starting businesses called organic gardening, and that is your business is going to come from the ground up here, and you've got to support those people with great ideas. But right now, we don't believe in ourselves out here in rural Minnesota. We just say, oh, woe is me. I don't believe that. I built an international company, and I can tell you the best thing you can do for someone, not give them a government program, give them a job. When Christmas comes around, I've never heard someone say to me, thank you so much for that government program and help me out. But what I have heard them say is, thank you for the opportunity to work for you, and thank you for the fact that I can have a Christmas with my kids. It is about growth, and it's about all of us getting together and believing that we can grow. Mr. Niles absolutely is right with the broadband connection. The newest growing force right now is the home-based workers, and they love the quality of life that we have out here. We need to go out there, you need to work with Rick UTEC, your Economic Development Corporation, and start attracting those workers here and get them on the grid.
Thank you. Mr. Willie.
Well, when I started in Upsall, I was told 3 things. I've been there for over a year now. 3 things. Number 1, find us some rental housing. Number 2, find us some senior housing. Number 3, get us some business. Well, 2 out of 3 was easy. We have senior housing coming in. We've got a contractor looking for rental units. We've also got a new cafe that I've seen from the ground up get implemented. This was built by something called TIF. TIF's a wonderful program. It's a tax increment finance program. I would encourage TIF districts anywhere, and I'm also looking for manufacturing now using TIF. Another way we can do this is by providing quality education. Quality education creates a quality workforce, which gives us a stronger middle class.
Thank you. Mr. Dooley.
There are no silver bullets. There are some things that would work very well. I'm going to tell you a whole series of things that you already know first. Minnesota has cold winters. Minnesota has hot summers. Minnesota has an older population, and especially here in rural Minnesota. They live in older homes. Those older homes are not very energy efficient. Minnesota has a lot of companies, good companies, that make doors, that make windows, that make insulation, that make heating and cooling, those that are efficient. And what Minnesota has, especially rural Minnesota, lots of unemployed carpenters and other tradespeople. The state of Minnesota needs to jump start. Energy efficiency retrofitting. We can pay for this out of the savings over a long period of time, but there are very few people who can pay the upfront costs. We can put these people to work, we can buy these Minnesota products, we can have people living in their own homes more cheaply, and it's jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka?
We should never try to pick winners and losers. It never works. Obama tried to pick Solyndra and a bunch of energy providers, and many of them are belly out. But we can and should make a difference. Minnesota ranks 45th out of 50 in business-friendly states. 45th. So you wonder why businesses aren't coming here or growing, expanding here. That's why. I'll just talk about stuff we can do until I run out of time. Regulatory reform, we started that, but we must make it easier for businesses to grow and expand here. The government red tape is unbelievable. You need to lower the business property tax. We talked about that. They pay 1.5 to 2 times what a resident pays, and another 30% to the state. We need to eliminate that 30%. We've got to get rid of frivolous lawsuits, and along with that, they get a 10% prejudgment rate, which means if the lawsuit's delayed, they're being charged 10%. My opponent voted for that. I never would have. Government was also charged that 10%, so the next year they repealed that extra charge on government, but on small businesses. We need to expand the angel investment credit, which was 25%. We want to bring it to 40% for companies investing in rural Minnesota.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson?
Well, having started 2 businesses in my life and watched what, or is witnessing right now what it's take to start my 3rd, all I can tell you is that the overregulation is just tremendous. For anybody, not just to move into Minneapolis, but to start a company from or come into Minnesota from out of state, why would they even want to come to this area right now? We're overregulated, we're overtaxed, the bureaucracy is just, it's off the scale. I don't know how many of you actually own a business out here, but it is tough. Very, very tough to try to maintain all the mandates that's going on out there. All it takes is just the government to just get out of the way. Every time they always try to solve a problem, it just keeps getting worse. So, in my eyes, is if the government people and the legislature would just free up some of the entrepreneurs in our state, we would flourish like we once used to.
Thank you. Our next question, gotta go back to funding and taxes. How can, if you can explain how, as a legislator, you can help balance Greater Minnesota's local government aid to the metro area, and how you can help restore some local government aid to the rural areas. And we will begin that with Adrian Welling.
That's a tough question, being a little one here. Working in local government, I deal with LGA and local government aid all the time. I spoke at a League of Minnesota Cities conference. They asked what LGA, are we going to restore LGA? Yes, I'd like to restore LGA, but to make it more fair with the metro, I'm going to be a little partial to rural Minnesota and think that we should probably have more than the metro, considering we don't have the tax base that they do there. Our property tax base is a lot smaller. They have the corporations, they have the room, they have the space to do increases on their property taxes. That's why their education has more money than we do, because they can pass levies. We can't. We don't have the tax base.
Thank you. Mr. Doody.
We do need to increase our tax base, there's no doubt. That's the key to everything. Wealthier areas put money into what's called the fiscal disparities pool. And poorer areas, that's us, take money out. If no money is going in because of other changes, and especially changes that come from people that aren't paying attention to this area, people that perhaps aren't from here, people that perhaps don't understand us, people who haven't grown up here, people who don't have their businesses here, people who don't raise their kids here. If you don't get it, if you don't feel it for this district, and you don't vote for it, then we get the short end of the stick. We saw it last time in property taxes. We see it when the cities that need it worst in LGA are the ones that are being cut. 3 of us up here are on city councils. We know what it's like to lose this LGA. We know that it's cut for reasons that are beyond the control of the cities. And we know that in many cases, it's a third to half of our budget. So we have to work on restoring this equity.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka.
LGA has been the exact same from 2010 through 2013. We froze it. The problem is we have automatic spending increases, whether at the state level, whether at the county levels, whether at the federal level, it doesn't matter. A lot of that's your automatic steps and lanes for state workers. Those are driving up the costs. And when we don't have the money, we don't have the money. So one thing we did do for rural Minnesota is we froze it. We said towns under 5,000 in the year 2013, population 5,000, are going to get the higher of the formula or that frozen rate. But this is extremely difficult. You have to know that if the government is $16 trillion in debt, we fought our way out of a $6 billion shortfall with no cash reserves. But that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. This is tough stuff. And that's why I say we are all in this together. This is not, I don't want to blame any local government. I don't want to blame the federal government. I want to say, hey, we got to roll up our sleeves. And it's not about more taxes. They have plenty of money.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
LGA is very important to our area. And since it has been frozen, we're going to have to deal with that until the formula changes. The legislature is the only one that can change that formula. In the meantime, for some reason, it just seems like the government itself has seemed to be lost in this idea that we're in a recession. And for them to just even freeze something like the LGA was very, very hard. We're all feeling it. We're being impacted by that. And again, until the economy comes back and we can actually put more money into that, we're just going to have to deal with it. But again, I'll come back to this other figure that I mentioned earlier. It's called $62 billion that we are taking in revenue in our state. And we're also going to spend that. Why can't we shift some of that and at least cover some of the rural areas?
Thank you. Mr. Niles?
As a member of the Wadena City Council, we've seen the impact of the reduction and the freeze in the local government aid, and it's been a constant fight over the last 4 years of the coalition of greater Minnesota cities, of which Wadena is a part, to fight at the legislature to try and eliminate these efforts to reduce it. And what you can see with what has happened with the property taxes and in the discussion of LGA is we need a stronger coalition of outstate legislators who work together to look out for the interests of rural Minnesota. There are essentially three power groups in this state. There are the two twin cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. There are the suburbs, and then there are the rest of us. And I can tell you, having been to 21 parades and talked to a number of legislators during the course of the summer, it's rural Minnesota that's taking it in the shorts. And so what we need to do is to have a strong coalition, bipartisan, of legislators who are willing to work together to look out for rural values and rural interests.
Thank you. Mr. Krisha?
There's only so much money, it's a finite amount, and I realize the battles down there are very contentious and can be very difficult. Mr. Niles mentioned groups of people. In my mind, there's only two groups of people. There's my district and everybody else. So when it comes to this, I'm going to go down there and realize that we have to fight for what we have. Those dollars are there, and I'm the only lobbyist for my district. The metro area, they have paid lobbyists, they have paid marketers, and they have legislators. I'm the only one for your district. That being said, let's take the stadium example. We were sold on the stadium. Hey, it's going to be great for rural Minnesota. Well, fine. Now let's go back and sell them on the fact that you come up and fish here, because I take them out hunting. I'm a hunting guide. I take them on the lakes. They're coming up and using our resources, and let's work with what we have. We have a great quality of life here, and those folks are coming up to use our resources, so let's find a way to enhance ourselves. I realize it's a finite. I'm not going to go down there and put new programs in place, but like I said, it's me against the world down there, and I'll go fight for what we need.
Thank you. We're going to switch topics and move a little more into maybe social issues. We have two constitutional amendments on the ballot this year. 4 years ago, we had one for the increasing the sales tax. So this is a two-part question. Do you feel that a constitutional amendment is the best way to handle subjects like the marriage amendment, voter ID, sales tax? And given the two on the ballot right now, how do you feel about those two issues, the marriage amendment and the voter ID issue? Lots to think about there. We will begin with Mr. Gazelka.
Well, I debated and authored and helped on the photo ID and the marriage amendment, so it should tell you why, or that yes, I'm supportive of both of those. Constitutional amendments have been around since the beginning of Minnesota. There's been over 200, over 100 have passed, so it's roughly one a year, so we're right on target there. The marriage amendment we wouldn't even have if courts around the country weren't overturning marriage laws. Massachusetts did that, and frankly, they just said we're going to have gay marriage. We would rather have the people of Minnesota to decide that issue. If you decide, if you vote yes, then only you can ever change that again. There's a lot of reasons why, I just don't have time, the time here. Photo ID, it boils down to right now you can bring 15 people with you. They can vote. Their vote counts, even if after we couldn't verify them as valid voters. Photo ID gets rid of that. You can only vote yourself. If you forget your ID, you can come and vote. Your vote will count if you come back and prove who you say you are. So I think these are both important, and that's what we did.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Well, state constitutional amendments seem to be a fact of our Minnesota life. I'd rather see the legislatures actually taking the time to work through a lot of these issues. With regard to these two amendments that are on before us, there's none of us that have not been in office that have had any part of this. So I can't really comment on that. However, how I do feel about the marriage amendment, I'm actually in favor for it, because it's a very simple thing. It doesn't really tell anybody what to do. It's just a definition of marriage. It's that simple. Anything else is just political hype. With regard to the photo ID, we've all heard the arguments. You have to have an ID for everything. It's the government. If the government says you need to have an ID, you need to have an ID. It works for everything else. Why not this?
Thank you. Mr. Niles.
I view constitutional amendments as change in the foundation of our government and should be used very, very sparingly. And so when I see contentious political issues brought before the public in the manner that they have, I'm saddened, because to me it represents the failure in the legislature that led to the shutdown. It represents the divisiveness that has plagued our legislature and our Congress in recent years. And it really is, in a large instance, a fight looking for a problem. And so from that standpoint, I'm saddened that we're spending so much time on that when we've borrowed $2.4 billion from our school systems, when our commissioners are having a hard time getting the brush cut along their ditches and are thinking about abandoning roads and those sorts of things. I think government should stay out of people's business and their lives to a large extent. And to the extent amendments seek to impose government into people's lives, to me that is something that we should try and avoid. So I would agree with Mr. Anderson that it should be the subject of legislation and not constitutional amendments.
Thank you. Mr. Creasy.
As I am out in the district and I'm talking to people, one of the biggest things I hear is about the marriage amendment. And what that tells me is people are concerned about it. And so I support that the legislatures put that on the amendment for you to decide, because otherwise it was going to be left to a judge or it's going to be left to a small group of people. And this issue is just too big. As Mr. Niles said, it does cut to the core of what our Constitution defines, and part of what our Constitution does is set up institutions and societies. And so I think the people should be able to decide that, and I'm glad that they're going to have the opportunity to do that. I personally support marriage as one man and one woman. It's how I look at it. It's not that I think that relationships outside of that don't have validation, there's ways to look at those. But marriage between one man and one woman should be held as that definition. On the voter ID, same thing. Again, a very important and contentious issue, and allowing our voters to decide the direction of that is going to be helpful. It was a divisive legislature session down there, and having the people decide this makes a difference.
Thank you. Mr. Willing.
Well, first I'm going to agree with Mr. Niles on the sparingly part of using constitutional amendments, so that's the answer to that part. Going into each one, starting with the marriage amendment, I think it showed misplaced priorities of our government. It's already a law, and I keep hearing this argument that it's going to stay away from the courts. Well, I'm pretty sure I hear every year things are found unconstitutional, so I don't know how it's going to stay out of the courts. On the marriage amendment, or on the voter ID amendment, I think it's an unfunded mandate that's being shifted down to local government. If we knew how it was going to work, I may be maybe for it. We have no idea how it's going to work. We don't know what it's going to do to the elderly. We don't know what it's going to do to mail-in precincts. The cost alone at the local level for cities that are mail-in ballots, there's 16 precincts in Morrison County in my district, none in Todd County in my district are mail-in, but that's 16 precincts that are now going to have to figure out how to pay for elections.
Thank you. Mr. Doty?
It's always a very difficult choice to see what rises to the level to go into the Constitution. It's been already said that we need to have important issues there. Personally, I feel that the First Amendment was of that importance. I feel that way because so many of my constituents, when I was in office, told me that. And so I believe very strongly that representative government means you represent your people, the will of the people. You don't impose your will on them. I think that's a very important distinction that we lose sight of sometimes. My family fought in the Revolutionary War, we fought in the Civil War. We did that to establish that in this country we have secret ballot. And how we vote up here is our business. There are curtains on that voting booth for a good reason in this country, and I hope that that never changes.
Thank you. Okay, have you all checked off on that column? Okay, next question. Many counties have been asking for more flexibility in how they spend some of the dollars that they get from the state, whether it be human services or other issues, other needs in the county. Would you, as a legislator, support giving the counties that flexibility? How would you feel about it? Why or why not? And we start this time with Mr. Anderson.
This is a really good question because I love bringing things back to home. You know, when you want to give power to the people, you bring it home. You want to start in a city, you're going to get some results that you'll scratch your head for the rest of your life. You bring it to the rural people to allow them to do what they want with the funds, and you'll get a totally different outcome than from a bunch of people in St. Paul dictating what each county has to do. So I would be in favor of allowing that flexibility.
Thank you. Mr. Niles.
I would need to know more about what it is in terms of the particular flexibility that's being looked for. Certainly having some discretion with funds to use them as you should within a certain particular area would make sense. But to eliminate mandates that the legislature has passed in innumerable areas and then just say, county, you get a blank check, which that question could presume, I would not be in favor of. So I certainly would allow for some flexibility, but I would need to know the specifics in what area, how many dollars, and what it would be taken away from in order to grant that flexibility.
Thank you. Mr. Creashan.
What we're really talking about is something that I hear time and time again, and that's mandates, whether you're at the school or you're in the fire department or you're working with any other area in your county. Unfunded mandates are the single biggest killers to us at the local level. And so we need to back those off. I'll differ with Mr. Niles. I think we have plenty of mandates that we can start to unwind, and we should start digging into those. The second thing is, whenever I look at economics, there's two principles that I look at. Those people that spend the dollar, raise the dollar in taxes, are the ones that know best how to manage that, and we should be helping by getting it down to those levels. If people are asking for more flexibility to spend their tax dollars, Why in heaven's name would we be at the state level saying, no, we know better than you? That's just wrong. And the second thing is people are imperfect. And if you're going to be 90 miles away making decisions for rural Minnesota, that's our biggest problem right now. So absolutely, I'm in favor of that. There's plenty of mandates on the books that we can start to unwind. So let's start that process right away.
Thank you. Mr. Welling.
I also would need to know specifics, but overall, I think that our local governments should be able to control more of their funding for the fact that they're the ones that work it. They know what they need the most. They know what their communities want, and they're elected also. Our